Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to share some thoughts on a wonderful book that I finished reading the other week when my family and I were gone on vacation called L'Abri by Edith Schaeffer. This is a book that was written in 1969 by Edith Schaeffer, who is the wife of the well-known missionary, apologist, evangelist Francis Schaeffer, who was a huge influence in the Western Church in the latter part of the 20th century, and his legacy very much continues on today. This is a book that is fitting into the story of Francis Schaeffer's life and giving a very intimate, personal look at the story of the ministry that God brought together in the form of L'Abri. Now, before I go on in my review, I need to probably explain a little bit about who Francis Schaeffer is and what L'Abri is if you want to know what to expect from this book. This is a book that kind of assumes that you've got some sense of who Francis Schaeffer is, what L'Abri is, because really this is the book that's kind of telling you the backstory to those things. But in our day and age, there are many people who have not heard of Schaeffer or L'Abri, so let me just start by telling you a little bit about the man and then the work that he did. So Francis Schaeffer, as I said, was a missionary, evangelist, apologist, pastor who was very influential in the kind of mid to late 20th century. He was actually a Presbyterian, confessional, conservative Presbyterian, educated in the same circles that would become very important for the formation of my own denomination, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. I don't think Francis Schaeffer was ever part of the OPC, or if he was, it was just very briefly, but he was sort of a Presbyterian of a similar stripe, operating in a similar environment, in that kind of conservative response to the liberalism of the 1930s and 40s and so on and so forth. He ended up becoming a pastor in St. Louis, Missouri for about 10 years, I think. But his denomination sent he and his wife, Edith, and their kids over to Europe right after World War II, just to kind of take stock of what was the state of the church, what were the needs that were there, and how might the church in America help to support the church in Europe. And what the Schaeffers found was that not only had the war ravaged the people in a material way, but that there was a great spiritual kind of famine in the European church. They saw a lot of people who had abandoned their faith in God, a lot of people who were embracing atheism or exploring and questioning different religious philosophies, whether that was a kind of mysticism, Eastern ideologies, or whether it was a very kind of Western materialist, communist view, whatever it might be. And they realized that the kind of Christian consensus that had marked Europe for so long was fracturing and fraying, and that there was a great need for missionaries and churches to be established that could answer the questions that people were wrestling with. And so the ministry that God ended up leading the Schaeffers into, because they saw this need and said, we should go. So they ended up moving to Switzerland in the 1950s, and God ended up bringing them to a small town in the Swiss Alps, and they had a chalet, a house there, where they would just open their home to people who would come visit. They didn't really advertise or solicit people, but people would hear about them from word of mouth, and they would come, they would stay with the Schaeffers, they would work on the property, they would work in the garden or the kitchens or whatever, and then they would be studying the scriptures, they'd be listening to lectures, and in the evenings there would be live, discussions, lectures, Q&A, conversations, very unstructured, very organic, going late into the night. And God used that ministry to bring many, many people, especially young people, to faith in Jesus Christ. So in the decades of the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the Schaeffers were basically opening their home, and people would just come and talk to them and ask questions. And Schaeffer gained this reputation of being this great apologist and evangelist. He ended up having a much wider platform. He was featured on the cover of Time magazine. He would go on to have a big influence on the American church, because he kind of had a foot in both the European and American scenes. And his legacy as an apologist and kind of cultural commentator and all of that was something that would become very, very influential. And all of that is tied to the work that they did at this place called L'Abri, which is just the French word that means shelter. And that was really the Schaeffer's vision and desire, was to have a place that would be a shelter, a place of safety where people could come with their questions, could explore Christianity, and could find answers to the things that they were wondering about. So that is kind of, at a very broad level, a bit of the story of Francis Schaeffer and the story of L'Abri. And as you can see, that ministry is tied very closely to his works. He would go on to write many books and give lectures in different places. And so many people, especially today, have encountered Schaeffer through his writings. But there's a very interesting little foreword that Francis Schaeffer wrote to this book by his wife, where he says, "This book and my books form a unity. The work of L'Abri has two interrelated aspects. First, there's the attempt to give an honest answer to honest questions, intellectually and upon a careful exegetical base. My books, The God Who Is There, Escape from Reason, and Death in the City," those are just some of his most well-known books up to this point. "My books are directed to this aspect," Schaeffer says. But then he writes, "The second aspect is the demonstration that the personal, infinite God is really there in our generation. When 20th century people come to L'Abri, they are faced with these two aspects simultaneously, as the two sides of a single coin. Now, in this book, this second side is presented." So Edith Schaeffer, Francis Schaeffer's wife, is writing this book to kind of give us that personal, hospitable aspect to the work of Francis Schaeffer, and is showing, very importantly, this is one of the kind of key takeaways for me, that part of the effectiveness of Francis Schaeffer's ministry was not just his intellectual achievements or his books or his training. That's all important. That's, again, one side of the coin. But the other side of the coin is the very personal, relational, and ministry of hospitality and of welcoming and of showing the personal love of Jesus through the lives of believers. And that's really what L'Abri was bringing together, this robust intellectual side along with this warm personal side. And so Edith Schaeffer takes it on herself in this book to give onlookers and outsiders a window into the work of L'Abri. And she does that largely chronologically. The story kind of begins with a bit of what I told you about, the story of the Schaeffers moving from America to Europe, and it walks you through the kind of winding path that God brought them to establish the work of L'Abri. Because the ministry that I described to you of this kind of house that was a haven for the intellectually curious and spiritually displaced, that was not something that they kind of came to Switzerland or to Europe with an idea of establishing. They didn't say, hey, we want to start this kind of a ministry, let's go and let's do it. Really, they just came to Switzerland saying, we see a great need in Europe and we want to be part of the solution. Let's go and see what God might do. But when they got there wasn't a very clear sense of what they were supposed to do, how it was supposed to happen, how it was going to be funded. There was a lot of question marks, and they were very much moving forward in faith. And as Edith unfolds the story of their ministry, what you find is God is kind of bringing them on this path that in the moment felt very kind of haphazard to them. Yet looking back, they could see, oh, God was, preparing the way for this bigger work of L'Abri that would go on to have such an impact and such an influence. And by the way, L'Abri still continues today. And not only is there a L'Abri in Switzerland, but there are L'Abris in various places around the world. So you can actually go look online. You'll find their website. And if you are someone who is wrestling with the claims of Christianity, you've got questions, L'Abri remains a very good place to go. There's some in the US, there's some in the UK, there's some in Switzerland. I think there's others in various parts of the world, but I would definitely encourage anyone who's kind of spiritually hungry, wrestling, searching, having questions, seek out that ministry because it continues to be a very influential and effective ministry today. And I know a few people personally who have gone to L'Abri and been greatly helped by it. But Edith is giving us the story of how that all got started and what you kind of walk away with. I won't go through every twist and turn of the story, but what you walk away with is very much a sense that God is the one who was bringing this about. It was not the result of human planning or ingenuity or strategy. It was God's people being dependent on God's Spirit to lead them into this very effective ministry. there's a sense in which, as I was kind of reading this book, that Edith is really just kind of giving us the prayer requests that they prayed, and then the way that God answered those prayer requests. The theme of prayer and of God's provision and faithfulness really run very strongly through this book. And, I came to this book, my family was going on vacation, so I was just kind of scanning my shelves to find a book that I didn't have to read. It just looked interesting, and this one kind of jumped out at me. And as I was reading it on my vacation, it was just such an encouragement, because I feel like in the church that I have the privilege of serving, we've had some challenging things, some big things that God has kind of called us to, that we have really seen him provide in and give answers to prayer to over the last 12 months. And even kind of beyond that, I can go back to the story of how I came to this church and the story of this church long before I was ever there, and just trace, God's hand of provision, his answer to prayer, and the way he was working. And so I felt like there were echoes of within the story of L'Abri, of what is happening at Catoctin, the church that I serve. And that was just so encouraging to me. And it was a reminder to say that those good things that happen are not things that we take credit for. They're not things that we produce. They're not things that we govern. It's God working as he chooses to. And that he delights to work through his people and often work through us in our weakness. And that's certainly something we've seen at our church. And that's something that the Schaeffers have saw at L'Abri. It also helps you to see that, when you look at a ministry like L'Abri, it's easy to say, oh, well, that's because they had Francis Schaeffer. It's because, everything just kind of fell into place for them. But when you read the story, you realize there were a lot of closed doors, a lot of opposition. At one point, they were basically kicked out of the country because of their work. They had to move to a whole different place and be uprooted. They had a string of health problems. They had periods in the ministry where Francis Schaeffer and his family had to leave and go back to America. And there was sort of a question of, okay, is this still going to work if Francis Schaeffer isn't there to answer the questions? And what they found was it wasn't tied to him. God was working through his people, proclaiming his word. And so it's a really, as I kind of step back from this to kind of give some concluding thoughts, why is this helpful? Why is it interesting? I think it's helpful for every Christian, but especially if you're involved in vocational ministry, if you're a pastor, or you're a missionary or something like that, an elder, a deacon, it'll be very encouraging to read, because you just see how God meets the needs of his people and how God works through the weakness of his people. And it's very encouraging. I think we're used to reading missionary stories and seeing God's amazing provision, but sometimes they took place long enough ago and in cultural contexts that are different enough from our own that it can feel kind of removed or distant. One of the things I liked about this is that a lot of the challenges they were facing was very kind of everyday challenges. Things like getting government visas, or getting the approval of a mortgage, or funding to open this ministry, or something like that. I mean, it was just things that's like, this feels familiar. I recognize these kinds of problems. And yet to see that God met those problems, just as he does, in more miraculous ways, as we might think about it. And the Schaeffers, through this combination of a very intellectual ministry, but also a very personal ministry, were able to have a huge impact. And I think Schaeffer has something to teach us there. And I think in our day, we're really, one of the challenges that we face, one of the tasks that I think the church needs to rise to, is the re-evangelizing or the Christianizing of the West. I'm mixing up my terms here. But that work is so important. And it's not going to happen just through writing books and giving lectures, as important as that is. Right? I'm a Presbyterian, I believe in those things. But it's when it's married to that personal life where people can see the life of Christ and see the work of the Spirit played out. That's what's so powerful and so effective. And Edith Schaeffer points to that. So for anyone in ministry, it's a great encouragement. Anyone who loves Schaeffer in particular, or wants to know more about his work, this is important. As he sort of said in the foreword, this is kind of the other side of the coin. People might engage him as an intellectual, as a thinker, as an apologist, and that's all good, well and good, but it's inextricably tied to the story. And so Edith is giving us a wonderful window into that. This is also just an enjoyable book to read. Edith Schaeffer, it's not as if Francis Schaeffer had the monopoly on the creativity or the intellect or anything like that. Edith Schaeffer was an impressive and in some ways a formidable woman, very gifted in hospitality, but very sophisticated in culture and the arts and intellectual questions and pursuits. And so she writes very well, and she shows a real cultural sensitivity. This book is also just beautifully produced. It's got, not only is it well written and enjoyable to read, but it's got these beautiful drawings. Here's kind of a map of the village that L'Abri is in and where L'Abri fits into that. And then sprinkled throughout are these beautiful ink illustrations of the different properties that they're talking about. So you've got a sense, you can sort of see it happening. So it's a wonderful book. Again, published in 1969. It's been republished many times since then. This is a very old copy. It's kind of fallen apart a little bit, but well worth getting your hands on if you can, and reading and being encouraged by and learning how to pursue that ministry that can be faithful to God and fruitful for people in our own day as well. So I would highly recommend picking up a copy of L'Abri by Edith Schaeffer.